Hey class, and welcome to week 3. I'm starting from the homepage because I want to show you folks a couple of things. One is I put a new announcement up. Your first essay topic is up, and I'll talk about that. It's in Module 3, which I'm going to be covering today, and it's due September 21st. And then also I want to point out on here, I know you've been going into modules to get your course content, but also the Q&A Cafe is down here as well. And if you click on there, has a wonderful werewolf drinking a cup of coffee. But this is also if you have any general questions for the class, things that you're not sure about, global stuff that I can ask, and then I can build an FAQ out of that as well. So put your questions here if you have those, and I also appreciate you folks sending me direct emails too, in case I'm a total doofus and forget to publish the module we're working on this week like I did. So apologize for that. So let's go to Module 3. And what we've got in here, the title of this one is Man is the Monster. So we've been talking about monsters. Now we're talking about man being the monster. And when I say man, you know, I know that's kind of sexist, but I am talking about men because men tend to be the monsters. There aren't a whole lot of female serial killers. There are a few, but for the most part, they're dudes. So we just got to face facts here. You've got a discussion here on serial killers, and I see some of you have already posted something here, so let's talk about your favorite serial killers, or other movie killers too, I guess. And then I'm going to get into the notes as well in just a second. Your links are here. This is where you can find 7, and then your study questions for 7 are up here as well, and then your essay, which is due next week. Here is your Dropbox for that. And this also has the prompt for it. So I want you folks to pick a monster. What does it represent? And when I say represent, I want you to dive to that second level, that subtextual thing. You know, how is it some sort of exaggeration of real world fears? How does it reflect on our society? What is the purpose of it? So I want you to use examples to state your case, whether that's from monster movies and an example of how that's used. Say if you're doing vampires, some examples of various depictions of vampires throughout movies. That's a possibility. If you're using more of a legendary monster like Bigfoot, you could talk about different versions of Bigfoot that people have talked about. I want you to use at least one source other than your notes. And when I say at least one, you'll get points for one source, but you'll do better if you have more. Cite your source at the point of use. So any source that you use, when you use it in your text, cite it then and there, whether it's a direct quote or if you're paraphrasing the information. Use inline citations, so book, author, date, page, or if you're using a web one, which you probably are, then author or title, date, and then list the full source and the works cited list. Don't give me a works cited list if you don't cite anything. That's a works not cited list. It shows me what you should have been citing in your piece. Okay, so that's due next week by midnight on Monday, and then there's going to be a rubric for that as well. Okay, so let's go back to the module. All right. So our topic this week, man is the monster. So man might be the scariest monster of all. And I've got a nice rogues gallery here of some of the most famous serial killers and other types here. I've got some genocidal maniacs as well. Some of these folks you will definitely recognize. Some of them you know by their names. Ed Gein is very important because he was a cannibal as well. And a lot of the horror movie killers were based on him to a certain extent, particularly Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, if you ever wondered what he looked like as well. John Wayne Gacy, who's also a clown. This is Albert Fish. Gary Ridgway, who a lot of people don't know what he looks like, but he looks like a totally normal guy that would probably do your taxes. But he was the Green River Killer, and he was one of the most long reigning serial killers. And then we have Andrei Chikatilo as well, who's a Russian one. I believe he was the Werewolf of Siberia. And there have been guys who've killed more than he has, but Yeah, he was operating for several decades there. And then we have our genocidal maniacs down here. Adolf Hitler, of course. Slobodan Milosevic, who a lot of you probably don't remember, but he was the Serbian dictator who just wave after wave of genocide in Eastern Europe. Idi Amin, who was another African dictator who kind of invented ethnic cleansing. William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a Union general during the Civil War. And normally we tend to demonize the Confederates, well, because of that whole slavery thing. But there were also some of the Union generals as well who had tactics that were very barbaric. So if you wonder why the South hates the North, William Tecumseh Sherman is a good reason for that. So you should read up on the guy. But there actually, he had like he even had a line he wouldn't cross. So when Ulysses S. Grant was president, he wanted William Tecumseh Sherman to go out, and he wanted him to basically kill all of the Sioux, the Lakota Sioux, and he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I've killed enough people, and so he had to find other people to do that for him. And then we have Pol Pot, who is responsible for the genocide in Cambodia as well. So we've got our serial killers, and we've got our genocidalists as well. And then moving down, we have some familiar movie killers. Of course, we've got Jason Voorhees. We have Michael Myers, not to be confused with Mike Myers, the Canadian comedic actor, although who knows what is underneath that Captain Kirk mask. And then we have Leatherface, of course, with his chainsaw. We have Ghostface Killer, not to be confused with Ghostface Killer. Hannibal Lecter, of course, who wasn't actually, Anthony Hopkins wasn't the original Hannibal Lecter. Just letting you folks know, in the movie Manhunter, the guy who does the McDonald's commercials now, where you just hear his voice, he was the original Hannibal Lecter, which every time I see a McDonald's commercial and hear his voice, that I think of Hannibal Lecter. And then we have Buffalo Bill, who is the real main killer in Silence of the Lambs. And then we have Patrick Bateman, and then we have Henry from Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, which is famous because it was one of the first widely released movies to get an X rating, because it's just so ridiculously bloody and graphic and very grindhousey. So how can a person become a monster? And I don't mean actually become as in transform into a monster like the stuff that we saw last week. I'm not talking about werewolves, getting bitten by a werewolf, all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about how can a normal looking person in the real world, and we have the movie versions as well, how can they become a monster? What do they have to do? So by killing, usually, they can be doing some other stuff too, but killing is usually the way you enter this club, and usually in a way which defies reason. So that includes serial killing, so they're killing with a purpose. Mass murder and genocide, that's another killing that defies reason. Why would a person do that? And then also cannibalism. So once you kill the person, you eat them. That tends to be a big no-no. Societally, we tend to frown on cannibalism now, although apparently it's been big in earlier times, and it was definitely part of certain cultures, but we don't like that anymore. But we may have to turn to it in the future, so just get ready for this, especially when we get to sci-fi. We'll talk about cannibalism again. So also other acts of violence, neglect, and inhumanity. You maybe don't necessarily kill someone, but you just maim them really badly or torture them. There are lots of different ways to do that, which can basically turn a person into a monster. So what is it that makes humans frightening? I mean, they don't have fangs and fur, and they don't necessarily drink blood, although some of them do. One reason is humans don't have to kill, but they do it anyway. And there's something about that that's just kind of crazy. It's like they just choose to kill. And maybe you have a crime of passion where they don't necessarily choose, they just lose it. That can happen too. But for the most part, we live in a society where we don't have to kill people. But sometimes that definitely they take that next step. Also, humans use all sorts of tools to make killing easier. So rather than, tearing somebody apart with their bare hands and fangs and stuff like monsters do, because that's what monsters do, humans will say, well, I'm going to kill a person. What kind of implement am I going to use next? Which is scary. Also, anybody could be one, and you'd never know. I'm going to go back. Look at Gary Ridgway again. Look at this guy right here. He looks so normal. I mean, he's got a kind of a resting fuss face, but he's a very normal looking guy. Who knew? Same thing with Ted Bundy right here. The ladies love Ted Bundy, and that's one of the reasons why he was so successful, is because he was a decent looking guy. He could lure ladies back. And then, Jeffrey Dahmer, who knew? He looks pretty creepy too. But anyway, the monster next door, okay? Anyone could be one and you wouldn't know. So, how do horror films portray them? You've got your masked slashers, of course, your mindless killing machines as well. Basically people like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, brilliant cannibals like Hannibal Lecter. So we're kind of taking this idea where there was cannibalism amongst serial killers, and it's something people have done, but you end up creating a character around that sort of thing. Charming and not serial killers. Some of the serial killers in movies are actually very charming. Some are very not, and they're just very scary. And then also the monster next door. You have movies where, it's like, is this guy a killer or not? I never would have suspected, that sort of thing. I was just reading about how much someone hated the killer in the movie The Lovely Bones because he just seemed so normal, but you just knew he was such an incredible creepazoid. Mindhunter is a Netflix series. They have a lot of serial killers in that it's like, wow, that person seems totally normal, but it just so turns out that they were a monster next door. So the film for this week is Seven, and I found this totally awesome poster of it. I'd never seen it before, but I think it's a good representation of the movie. It kind of gives a few things away that maybe it shouldn't, but it's there, okay? And of course, if you're writing Seven, you have to have 7 as your V instead, which I think is just totally brilliant. So it's from 1995, directed by David Fincher, who also did Fight Club, of course. Prior to that, he did Alien 3, which was kind of a mixed success, a movie with everyone had to shave their head. That was like the major art move in it. So our synopsis in this: detective new on the job and a veteran on the cusp of retirement are confronted with a baffling and grisly string of murders in a city in which the sun never shines. I can also show this in my 14C class, my gangster and detective class, as a buddy cop film as well, because there's that element to it as well. So is this a horror film or is it a neo-noir crime thriller? It's both. I can show this film for either of those two classes, and it has enough elements of both. It's kind of a 50-50 split in a way. So yes to both of those questions. This is one of the watershed films of the dark and gritty 90s. Those of you old enough to remember what the 90s were like, which is probably none of you, because most of you were born like when this movie was made or even afterwards. This was this is what the 90s were like. In 1995, this is what our music was like. Our culture was getting into that. There were a lot of movies that were really kind of plumbing this darkness, and this film really kind of set the tone for that. And a lot of films were imitative of it and didn't do nearly as well. This film also contributed to my phobia of air fresheners. I hate air fresheners. I just can't stand the way they smell. They drive me crazy, particularly this one right here, this Royal Pine car freshener. When you watch this movie, especially if you haven't seen it before, you'll understand why. It just gives me the chills thinking about it. So your video links are here. I now have the real video links now. So if you folks haven't used this before, if you click on this movie link, it takes me directly there because I'm already logged in, but it will ask you for a username, and then we'll also ask you for a password too. So the username is WM Clay and the password is media. That's why I put that on all these, so you can always go back and look for that. But click on it and you should be able to play it directly. You don't have to download these things or anything, and they look pretty damn good too. Okay. And that's what I'll be doing with all the movies from now on. And then here are your study and discussion questions. I want you to be able to answer all of these and then post them here. I see no one has done that yet, so hopefully you folks are planning to do that. Maybe you're waiting for me to do this lecture and put it up. Probably. Sorry it's taken me so long. It's been a rough week. So, questions this week. At what points does this film resemble a crime thriller? So look for those elements that definitely seem from a detective film. And then at what points is it a horror film? Look for those moments where it's like, oh yeah, we're definitely in a horror film right now. What is it that gives you that palpable sense of that? Number 2, what are the killer's motivations? What is he trying to say here? And then also, what does this say about society in the 90s? I realize most of you don't have a background in that, but I'm sure your parents told you. Maybe. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they didn't want to talk about the 90s. I thought the 90s were pretty awesome, but they were pretty dark. They definitely talk about that in the movie too, so you can definitely glean that information from there. Number 3, why is the relationship between Somerset and Mills important? So these two detectives at different stages of their career, why is their relationship here important? Number 4, how do you think this film has influenced other horror and crime films since 1995? Look for some things going on there, technically going on in it, maybe story elements, things like that, acting, whatever, cinematography, lighting. See if you notice something in this. Like, oh yeah, I definitely have seen this going on in something else. And then number 5, why is the identity of the killer extra disturbing? And I'm talking about just like when you see who the killer is in this, why does it like give you the extra heebie-jeebies here? And from both a story perspective and a real you being a human perspective as well. So, well, that's it for this week. Do this stuff, and I will see you next week.